So my name is Audrey, and my research project looked at flooding as a driver for sustainable government at a local level. There we go. So floods rank among the highest for weather-related fatalities and property damage in the United States. There's evidence that the average annual flood count has been increasing since the 1960s, as well as the average annual damage from flooding has been increasing since the 1960s. So it's important for us to understand the factors that drive sustainable policies regarding to flooding, because it is such a serious issue in the country. So the broad question that I started with was, do extreme events shape sustainable government practices or influence policymaking? For my project specifically, I examined how flooding events affect policy at the local level. So sustainable policy is such a broad concept, but for the purpose of my study, I define it as mitigation and adaptation measures that reduce the threat of floods and increase the community's resiliency. So after doing research looking at other studies that have looked at the same things in terms of natural hazards and flooding and government, as well as the theoretical framework, I came up with a primary and a secondary hypothesis. The first being that there's a positive relationship between flooding and the adoption of sustainable water and flood policy at the local level. And then the second one is that this relationship is not uniform. It is dependent on outside social and political factors. So this is kind of a diagram I put together to kind of show the different relationships I'm looking at. And so I primarily am going to zoom in on property damage and look at how it influences flood policy. So I had a two-part approach. The first part was examining this relationship between policy and flood damage using a cross-sectional approach. This involved creating a data set by merging two separate data sets, one of flood damage and one of flood policy, and then running statistical analyses on these data. And then the second part was to identify outliers and outstanding cases in this data and use a qualitative approach to learn why they reacted the way they did. And I did this primarily through exploratory interviews. So the first data set that I worked with for my policy data came from the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program Community Rating System. This program incentivizes the adoption of proactive flood policies by offering discounts on flood insurance premiums. So the way it works is there are 9 classes, 9 being the least active, 1 being the most active. You increase your class score by adopting more proactive policies. They have like 19 that you can adopt. And then, so if you have a 1, you get the best discount, and it increases from 9 to 1. So my dependent variable was CRS class rating, the most recent reading for the country, and this is a national sample size, including 1,288 cities and counties across the country. I operationalized my hypothesis by using the CRS class rating, which I'd like to note. While I say there's a positive relationship between policy damage or policy, flood policy, and flood damage, the CRS class is an inverse relationship because it goes from 9 to 1 instead of 1 to 9. So it's just something to keep in your mind that I'll be getting negative, it'll be a negative relationship even though it represents a positive one. So then I merged all of these with a data set from the Spatial Hazards Events and Losses database for the United States, which is a nationwide inventory of flood data from 1960 to 2014 at the county level. So I was able to get the total property damage from flooding between 1960 and 2014 for each community participating in the CRS program. I also tested damage over the last 10 years as another variable. So to analyze this data set that I created, I first ran descriptive statistical analysis of the total property damage for each CRS group. So even though there are 9 classes, I put them into 5 groups by combining the first 5 classes. As you can see on the right, the first group is all 5 instead of just the 1s and 5. And then I had to normalize the distribution because it was non-normal using a log conversion. And then I ran the ANOVA test and the regression for the entire data, and I will get to that in a minute. So here you can see that I started with a non-normal distribution, and then I took the log of property damage to get a more normal distribution. Then I ran the analysis of variance test to determine whether the mean damage among CRS groups are significantly different. I got a significance level of less than 0.001, which indicates that there is a statistically significant relationship. It is not accidental. The relationship is negative, which means more damage associated with lower CRS class, which is associated with stronger policy. So the relationship is shown here on the left. And then I ran a regression test to determine how much of this variation in class is explained by the log of damage, total damage. The R value, or the R squared value I got is very weak, which means that property damage only explains about 4% of the variation of CRS class. Then I did the same thing for the total damage over the last 10 years and got very similar results. So there is an association, it is there, but the signal is very weak, which means that communities in the CRS program are slightly influenced by past flood damage, but the influence is very small. There must be other forces that influence the community CRS score, and also there is a chance that my data may not accurately represent the influence of flooding. So then I moved to my second part, which was exploratory surveys. I recognized from the beginning that other factors would have an influence on sustainable flood policy. So I selected communities from my data set that stood out, whether they had a really large amount of damage, but they weren't very active in the CRS program, or just they had a really, I looked at the ones with the best CRS classes, anything that kind of stood out. And then I surveyed their CRS representatives and floodplain managers to learn what was motivating them to try for these high scores or settle for low scores. So the communities with lower CRS class numbers, which I'll note are the active ones, I came up with a few reasons and factors that I got from my interviews. A lot of them really said they had strong departments and effective communication between departments and policymakers and stakeholders. A lot of them had pre-existing policies and master plans in place before they joined, so that when they joined, they already had, they joined on like a 7 instead of a 9, and then they already had access to the types of resources and equipment that enabled them to move through the classes. Also, some may not have experienced a lot of flood damage, but they experienced damage from other storm hazards, which may have an influence. And then also, some solely joined and progressed based on their location on FEMA's flood map. So if they were designated to be in a 100-year floodplain, they're required to have insurance. And it just made sense for them to keep moving forward because of this. Then communities with higher CRS class numbers, the less active ones, a lot of times I found were limited based on administrative capacity, so they didn't have enough funds or staff to really go far. Political limitations, as well as economic and market factors and public opinions towards regulation. I picked out 2 quotes from the surveys and interviews I did that stood out to me. The first one was, the more you regulate how and what people can do with their properties will affect how the town is perceived in the eyes of a potential buyer. The second is trying to convince people that flood insurance is necessary in more affluent areas such as oceanfront properties is a hard sell. So this just kind of shows that there are other factors and things that are keeping them, they might have experienced a lot of damage, but there are things that have kept them from moving forward. So in conclusion, there is weak support for my primary hypothesis. There is an inverse relationship between CRS class and total property damage from flooding. The relationship is very weak, but it is there. Further investigation should explore other sources of flood data that may be more comprehensive or accurate, and then control and measure for other influences on policy to see what's going on here. I'm thinking that it could be interesting to look at each state and look at a whole bunch of different variables to really figure out what's going on and making this happen. So I'd like to acknowledge my mentor, Dr. Gary Pilo, for his continued guidance and advice throughout the research and development process, as well as the UWIN program as a whole for this financial support throughout the summer. So any questions?